High Five BR, this episode of Making History with Miss Boykett and Miss Ryan will explore the colonial life from Aboriginal people's perspective.
Do you remember last episode when we recapped the events of colonisation and briefly looked into the types of people it had an effect on? We called these inhabitants. This episode is going to deeply explore what life was like for Aboriginal inhabitants during colonisation.
We will look at their life before colonisation, including what they wore, what they ate, what they did on a day-to-day basis, the language they spoke, the housing they lived in, and also the life of their children. We will be exploring the impact that colonisation had on their lives, and lastly, how this made them feel.
The Aboriginal people of Australia lived in small communities and tribes, which were mainly extended family groups. As you can see from this painting, Aboriginal people liked to live their lives naked, which might seem strange to you now, but this was just normal for them. You see them out on the water in canoes, which were handmade from natural materials such as sticks and bark. The Aboriginal people lived off the land. They fished and hunted their food with spears, which was their way of life and how they survived. However, they never took more than they needed.
This picture is another example of how Aboriginal people use natural resources in their day-to-day lives. As you can see, they have used sticks and bark and whatever other resources available to build shelter for their families. Fire also played a big role in the survival of Aboriginal people. It was used as a resource for warmth and protection and also cooking.
Males and females had different roles within their tribes. The men were hunters and warriors, whereas women were responsible for food preparation, looking after the children, and collecting supplies.
After 60,000 years of living off the land, the arrival of the First Fleet in 1788 disrupted the Aboriginal people's way of life. Initially, the European explorers had friendly relations with the Aboriginal people, as Governor Phillip always encouraged the new settlers to treat Aboriginal people fairly.
The relationship changed and became hostile when Aboriginal people realised that the colonisers would seriously disturb their lives. How would you feel if someone came into your house and started eating your food and sleeping in your bed? Well, this is exactly what the settlers did to Aboriginal people. They took away land, natural food resources, and the order of a nomadic life from Aboriginal people.
When Lachlan Macquarie became governor in 1810, the clashes between the settlers and the Aboriginal people increased. Governor Macquarie believed that the best way to treat Aboriginal people was to civilise them. That meant replacing the traditional way of life with the European ways.
Macquarie tried to send Aboriginal children to school, but many left or returned to their tribes after a short time. Macquarie tried to create a settlement for Aboriginal people by teaching them farming and building techniques. This failed because Aboriginal people did not want to become farmers.
After all of his failures, Macquarie then made laws to place Aboriginal people under British control. Under these laws, it was permitted to shoot Aboriginal people if they resisted. Another consequence of the British settlement was the reduction of access to land and water sources. The settlers took the view that the Aboriginal people could easily be driven away from their lands. By the 1870s, all the rich areas of Australia had been taken from Aboriginal people and given to the white settlers. The loss of the land and other essential resources such as food and water posed great danger to Aboriginal people who were left with no place to live and nowhere to hunt food. Already weakened by the new disease spread by the new settlers, Aboriginal people had dramatically reduced chances for survival.
European livestock ranches over vast areas also resulted in loss of land for Aboriginal people. From these ranches, Aboriginal people had a new supply of fresh meat, which changed their nutrition, their eating habits, and ways of finding food.
As a consequence, Aboriginal people started to depend on European settlers for their food and livelihood. In the later 19th century, new settlers took vital parts of the land in the north, such as waterholes or soaks, for their own use. They introduced sheep, rabbits, and cattle. These animals took over lush areas of the land. Consequently, the native animals that Aboriginal people depended on to hunt began to disappear. Aboriginal people started to hunt sheep and cattle as they could no longer rely on hunting native animals.
Summary of what you have learned in this episode: the British colonisers were welcomed, or at least not opposed, by Aboriginal people in the beginning. With time, an increase of British settlement, there were more and more conflicts between the white settlers and Aboriginal people, which often resulted in mass killings. In 1788 and 1900, the Aboriginal population was reduced by 90%. Three main reasons for this were the introduction of new diseases, loss of land, and loss of people through direct fighting with the colonisers.
This episode of Making History with Miss Boykett and Miss Ryan has given you an introduction and a brief overview of the life of Aboriginal people during colonisation. Have a read of the information below and head over to the learning activities to deepen your understanding of this topic. Tune in next week to look at a convict's perspective of colonisation. See you then!